Hello. Hi, everyone. I'm Nora Burnett-Abrams. I am the Mark G. Falcone Director at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Denver. And we want to welcome and thank you so much for being with us, joining us for the final episode in our 4-part series, NFTs, Putting the Fun in Non-Fungible Tokens, which is generously sponsored by Sotheby's.
Hi, Nora and everyone. And I'm Amy Whitaker, blockchain researcher in the arts and an assistant professor of visual arts administration at New York University.
Amy, it is so good to be with you once again. I think next Wednesday we're just going to have to come together in some fashion because I will miss you.
Same.
So here we are, November 10th, focusing on equity and future states. Last week, we spoke with Beatriz Ramos and Judy Mam, who are the founders of the collaborative drawing platform Dada, about their Creeps and Weirdos NFT sale, as well as the collectors, market experts, and auction house practitioners about the complexities of buying and collecting NFTs. Artistically, technologically, and legally under frameworks that include anti-money laundering and privacy regulation. You can find that episode on MCA Denver's YouTube channel if you missed it. And this week we are going to explore who is still excluded from the NFT phenomenon and really focus on the possibilities for greater inclusion and equity and the ways in which NFTs could kind of keep evolving in the future.
Right. No, exactly, Nora. And I think these core questions we've had the whole series have been with us, but today we really get to look more closely at the first one, this question of advancing equity and redistributing power, which leads into the theme of blockchain and its impact on the art market, and as ever, our quest to engage meaningfully as generalists with, of course, our as ever evergreen welcome to anyone with a cryptography PhD.
As we've mentioned, this is our 4th and final episode in this 4-part series. So if you've enjoyed it, you can hit the red subscribe button below this video so that you don't miss future content and programs and live streamed events, and also catch up on those that you might have missed over the last few weeks.
And so we've been talking the whole time about these intersecting stories. And of course, all of these stories are still present. But tonight, we really want to focus on artist stories and democracy stories. And in a way, the work that we've been doing the last 3 episodes has been to lay out a root structure for what we want to talk about tonight.
Absolutely. I think what we're hoping to dwell on tonight are really questions for which there are no clear answers maybe right now. But I think what's so exciting, and in a sense, the question that we're going to be ending with tonight are the questions that Amy and I really started to kind of that launched the program. It's the questions that we started thinking about at the very beginning. And so for us, this circular metaphor kind of perpetuates in bringing us together and in kind of tying these different stories together.
Definitely. I love how you describe that as the plot structure of French existentialist cinema. Like, guess what? We're back at the beginning.
Raise your hand in the audience if you caught that.
No, I'm teasing. I think what you say really resonates for me, because it's one of these situations where the world is changing rapidly and we're inside the changing world. And so the greatest anchor is not what are the answers to these questions, but are we asking the right questions, and can we continue to engage with them? So we have 3 goals along those lines for tonight's episode 4. The first is to talk about equity for artists. This is new forms of economic sustainability that can come about through fractional equity and resale royalties. And the second is collaboration and community practice, the way these systems of royalties and equity and kind of asset formation for and by artists can expand into community practice, where artists can band together and come up with cooperative structures and governance models around risk pooling and shared upside. And the third, I'll say a tiny bit, and then Nora, I'll volley it to you, is once we start talking about art from an artist point of view and start talking about equity and shifts in power structure and community governance models, when we start talking about governance, we're really well into the territory of arts organizations like museums and the way that blockchain impacts that practice.
Absolutely. I think the ways that NFTs are used for collecting, fundraising, even revenue, audience participation, and exploring and kind of grounding themselves in decolonizing practice. I think that's in so many ways, that's how Amy and I really kind of reconnected initially earlier this year, that really birthed this program. It's because of her work on fractional equity and what that means, not just for artists, but for museums as well. So I want to just take a moment. We are always we always have a chance to introduce our guests that we kind of bring on, but I want to have a chance to introduce Amy and her research, because it's so it's the kind of central node from which all the other conversations are going to emerge later this evening. So Amy is not just a leading researcher on blockchain, but also on the singular research of fractional equity for artists, and ultimately how that might impact arts institutions, as she shared earlier. So in case you didn't know, she is the recipient of the Edith Penrose Award from the European Academy of Management for trailblazing research that challenges orthodoxies of a field and then has a profound impact. She has generated something that did not exist prior, that the ripple effects of which we're still trying to understand. And so with that kind of teeing you up, Amy, I really welcome the chance for you to share more about, in particular, your research on fractional equity and how we can think about it beyond just for artists and for their own market, but how we can think about it at a larger scale.
Well, Nora, first of all, thank you so much for your generous introduction and the pleasure and privilege of getting to think with you in the construction of this program. And as you mentioned, this is how we reconnected, which is thinking about museum deaccessioning and how that relates to blockchain and decolonial practice. So maybe what I'll do is start from the top with the question that animated the space for me, which was the difficulty of valuing art and the difficulty of doing that for artists from an artist point of view. And the idea that is really central to that is this idea of inventing point B. And so it's very hard to know how to value a work of art. It's hard to know how to do that at a point in time because there's so many definitions of value: social, cultural, economic. People don't agree. What finance professors call it's a private value asset, subjective valuation. But it's also really hard to value a work of art over time. And this is because of the nature of a work of art as an act of discovery and not just production. The German philosopher Martin Heidegger wrote an essay called On the Origin of the Work of Art, 1947, where he essentially said that a work of art is something new in the world that changes the world to make space for itself. And what that really means is that if you're making a work of art in any area of life, you're not going from a known point A to a known point B, you're inventing point B. And that means that we're living in a point A world where we have to invest time and resources, and we don't know if we'll create anything of value until the point B world that our efforts lead to. This is incredibly common as a problem for artists, and is part of the discussion around resale royalties. So, for example, in 1958, the US artist Robert Rauschenberg sold a work for $900 that was then sold in 1973 for $85,000, and he didn't receive any of these proceeds. So the idea is that it would make sense for artists who take risk to make work in the point A world to get some of the benefit in the point B world. So my original introduction to resale royalties is also my introduction to blockchain, which is that in 2012, the social practice artist Caroline Woolard invited a group of us to think about what property meant for artists. And I looked at resale royalties as property. So resale royalties exist in 70 plus jurisdictions worldwide. The United States doesn't have them except kind of in California from a 1977 piece of legislation that was gutted on appeal. So the criticisms are that they're not well enforced. They only support artists who are already wealthy and successful, or they constitute a form of welfare to artists, which makes artists a special class. So for me, there are two kind of moves in this line of thinking. And the first was that resale royalties are property rights. And what that means is that they can be traded even when a work of art is not traded, if there's a marketplace. And the second is that I didn't want to listen to these arguments that artists were receiving welfare just to be structurally included in the value that they help to create. So I proposed instead a system of fractional equity. So I proposed this in a couple of conceptual papers and then started working on it empirically with a collaborator, Roman Kreuzl. And what we did is we took archival records from artists like Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg, honestly, because of data availability. And then we expanded to a couple of galleries. And we imagined what would have happened if the artists had received less money when they first sold their work. So they paid in foregone income to retain 10% equity in their work. And what we learned was that they outperformed the US stock market by an almost embarrassing, difficult to publish margin. There is a work by Jasper Johns that outperforms the S&P 500 by 1,000 times. This is a 20 to 40% return every year from 1970 to 2005, which if you ran a hedge fund would be extremely, legendarily impressive. So we started to explore kind of what would happen if this system developed and kind of how it could extend to, not just capitalistic forms of artists are motivated by profit, but structural ideas of how artists who are creating something of value could be credited. So what's interesting is that this is a market idea, but a market idea that syncs up to what I would call the solidarity economy, which is actually what Caroline Woolard and many of her other collaborators work on now. They've gone from convening a property group, where she used to run a barter economy school for artists, to these governance models where there's a form of generating resources and then sharing them across the group, taking surplus and investing it in projects. So this is an extremely important area of governance research. I flag here the Open Collective Foundation, which Caroline works on with a number of collaborators, including Mike Strode and Nathan Hewitt, and also the Meta Governance Project, or metagov.org, which is a study of all these different governance models that can be used to distribute proceeds. So we can think a little.
Amy,
yeah,
can I
jump in.
Ask a couple questions.
Of course.
This is like so much. I don't know if anyone else's head is exploding. I think just to kind of underscore the kind of profundity of what your research revealed vis-a-vis. We're just taking Jasper Johns because there was a lot of data available about his market. So you're saying if he had retained a 10% ownership stake in his work, which meant that in 1972, when he sold that work, he would have gotten less in 1972. But over time, he would have retained equity or a piece of ownership in that work. And as it was sold and resold, however many times, he would get a portion of the sale as it was being transacted, so that he's continuing to benefit from the ongoing sales of his work, which is effectively, as I understand it, what resale royalty was supposed to do. But right. In practical life and in legislation here in this country, doesn't do. Is that correct?
Right, exactly. The resale royalties legislation is structured a little bit more like a tax or a surcharge because of the way it's capped and the way that it is not taken against a cost basis, meaning that it's on the entire price, not the increase in price from the last transaction. What's important about it is that fractional equity is just a way of talking in a structural way, as if the market itself is the art project, about how to deal with this problem of misaligned value. So if we took the case of the Rauschenberg work I mentioned, Thaw, which sold in 1858, so it sold for $900, which means Rauschenberg got half. But Rauschenberg could have foregone 10% of the price, so he would have gotten it would have been $810, right? And he would have gotten his share of that. And then when the work resold, he would have gotten 10% of the auction price, which is $8,500, right? So in the research, not to be in the weeds of it, but if you retain 10% and you invested in the S&P for a Jasper Don's work, you might get $3,200. And if you take 10% of the auction price, you might get $640,000.
I mean,
so it's a really enormous scale difference. Yeah. And we could be philosophical about that. Is the art world still developing at the same rate? Are the things that are selling for a lot of money now going to sell for a lot of money in the future? And there's certainly many, many questions of the nature of value in art. And
yeah, and also just, why some artists have, they see their markets kind of take flight and they're not a part of it because their works are being flipped or turned over very rapidly. And they can't keep up, and their future production now has to compete at a level that maybe it can't. So that this is a way to kind of stabilize the markets for artists as well, even if there are other agents at play, if you will, or actors at play who are trying to bulk it up. They continue to benefit from that.
Exactly.
With this model.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the things we'll get into in a moment when we start to bring in some of our guests is how this is a long-standing conversation among artists to have a share of the upside in their work, and also a long-standing conversation about collaboration and pooling risk so that if one person succeeds, everyone succeeds a little bit. But the thing to really highlight here is that it's really hard to apply tools of markets to artistic practice because art is discovered in a high-risk environment in which artists are the original investors, but they don't hold shares in the value that they create necessarily. And blockchain makes it much easier for artists to hold these shares because the resale royalty is automated into a lot of the platforms. So no one has to send a fax and go collect it or go through a rights agency. It just happens. The title doesn't transfer on the blockchain unless the royalty is paid. And what we're seeing is that certainly benefits individual artists, but it benefits groups of artists too. And what we're trying, I think this is a question Nora and I are both really actively engaged in learning about. And I don't want to say it's the brain-breaking question, but it's definitely a complicated one, is what the governance models are around that. And I think what we really want to do, partly, I have some distant background and continued interest in museums, and Nora is obviously an esteemed museum director, is to think about what this means for communities of artists, but also communities around arts organizations. So we have lived through an acute time of kind of reckoning with questions of board governance and the kind of, I don't know, Cheyenne, if you want to share that, thanks. This kind of idea of equity in the practice of museums, I think many people have followed, certainly many people in the arts have followed the conversation around whether members of the Sackler family or Warren Kanders should have seats on museum boards given the source of their wealth. Some museums have been deaccessioning parts of their collection in order to increase representation by underrepresented artists, groups of artists. And we're also starting to see, I'm certainly starting to get a lot of off-the-record confidential calls from people in museums who are trying to figure out what they might do with NFTs. And some of that starts from a fundraising perspective, but I think has really interesting implications for audience engagement and community governance.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. And I think we're just so at the very beginning, it's what I keep going back to what Kevin McCoy said in episode 2, that we are at the beginning of this arc, this 30-year arc of tokenization. And we don't even know yet where it's going to lead and what it's going to usher in and what the possibilities are. But I think the implications or the systems and the pillars of the kind of ecosystem of museums and arts organizations certainly are being interrogated through this lens of and it's how we acquire. Well, we're non-collecting, but how one acquires for collection. Who owns it? Do you own collectively? Do you, when you de-accession, what is the mechanism for that? How could it benefit earned revenue? One of the early slides that you shared, I think in the first episode, Amy, was this idea of going from one work, the Mona Lisa, to then many Mona Lisas on mugs and t-shirts and keychains, et cetera. And that is a source of earned revenue. So how do you think about it in the reverse, where you have all these different images floating around on the internet, and then you have the NFT of it, and you've created one, and the power of ownership, and how do you, can you monetize that? Can you sell it? And so I think, for all of these reasons and well beyond, blockchain offers a lot of possibilities, and NFTs maybe specifically offer a lot of possibilities for business operations kind of going forward.
Right. And you're making me think of what Eduardo Barillo said last week when he tried to donate a CryptoPunk to ICA Miami, and it was really difficult for them to insure the work, and they're not allowed to accept uninsured donations. And it's also very complex to get a tax valuation on a work like that. So it had been living in escrow with his art advisor. So I think these things are really complicated for everyone to navigate, for sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think that is a great segue to kind of open it up, since there are so many possibilities. Let's bring on some of the voices and perspectives that are helping us really imagine different ways of harnessing the technology and the possibilities for artists. So I want to say we are so happy to invite a number of expert voices here tonight. And they're going to be joining us at different times throughout the program, but we wanted to kind of introduce them all at once. So Amy is going to do that, and then we will be joined by some of them immediately after.
Great. Thank you so much, Nora. So what I'll do is I'll tell you each of the people and give you a little bit of an overview so you can start to track the story itinerary that we're charting, and really excited to explore with our guests. First, Lauren Van Haftenschick is a Smithsonian Institution predoctoral fellow and also a fellow at the Engelberg Center at NYU Law School. She's an expert in the 1971 artist contract, and she'll be talking with us about artists receiving a percentage of resale via that contract, and also about the more radical ideas artists had around the time of the formation of that contract to start to share proceeds across themselves. Again, this risk pooling. And then we'll get to talk with Kalani Nicole, who's a founder of Transfer Gallery and also a trustee of the Current Museum, which collects digital art. She'll talk about an exhibition she did at Transfer in which artists they were able to share proceeds. So if a work sold, a percentage of the revenue went to the artist and a smaller percentage was shared across all of the artists. She's also actively co-leading a working group of artists who are forming DAOs, or decentralized autonomous organizations. And we'll get to ask her to tell us especially what that means, if anyone's still getting crisper on DAOs. And after we talk with Kalani, we'll get to talk with Art Grayson, who's the founder of Ujamaa. Art is really kind of like singular voice in this space. I would absolutely describe him as a polymath. He's a neurobiology researcher who was very early to discover Bitcoin and to research that. And Ujamaa is the world's first social crypto market specializing in art assets by artists of color. So again, you can see how we're engaging in these questions from equity to collaboration to restructuring and redistributing power and proceeds. And then lastly, we'll talk with Cheryl Finley. Dr. Finley is the inaugural Distinguished Visiting Director of the Atlanta University Center Art History and Curatorial Studies Collective, or the AUC Art Collective for short. And she's going to help us synthesize across these questions of equity for artists and the impact of these changes on museums and community governance. Dr. Finley is really singular in her approach, not only kind of in her work at the AUC Art Collective, but also as a scholar, an author most recently of the 2018 book, Committed to Memory, Art of the Slave Ship Icon, published by Princeton. So we're really excited to get to talk with all of these speakers, and I will turn it over to you, Nora, to bring them on.
Wonderful. Lauren, Kalani and Art, come on over. Hi, Lauren. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm great. We're so happy you're here tonight. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And what a fantastic group of people you've assembled, and what a brilliant introduction. And I admire the research of all of everyone who's participating so much. And I want to give a special thanks to Dr. Cheryl Finley, who's actually my doctoral advisor too, who's really shaped a lot of my thinking in this area. So
that's great. Fantastic. Wonderful. I didn't realize that. Well, Lauren, we wanted to kind of share. We wanted to ask you about. Sorry, I don't know why it was hard to say that word. When we had Kevin McCoy on in episode 2, he talked about how he used the term, some of the terms from the Siegel-Brzezinski agreement, known as the artist contract, when he first set up his platform Monograph in 2004. So we would love to just hear from you at the outset. Just what is the artist contract? What is its origins, and how does it show a way forward?
Sure. So the artist contract is a standard form agreement for artists to use whenever they sell their work or when ownership changes hands through gift, trade, etc. It was written in 1971 by Seth Siegelob, the curator and dealer of conceptual art, along with an attorney, Robert Brzezinski. So importantly, Siegelob and Brzezinski were participants in a real wave of activism among artists at the time, where artists came out protesting, for example, against control that institutions and collectors have over their work, and against the ways in which the ballooning art market really was only serving a very small handful of artists.
And this was in the early 70s. So
yes,
it's remarkable that many of those criticisms very much remain in the art world.
Yeah. And so it's the key terms of the contract are designed to address those issues by giving artists a resale royalty of 15% of any increase in the value of their work when it resells. So essentially, it's actually like 15% of the collector's profits. And it also gives artists the right to approve of any exhibitions of their work. It gives them a percentage of loan fees if the work is loaned to, say, a museum show, and there's a fee paid. It protects them from their work being damaged or destroyed. And it was really widely circulated by artists and by lawyers at the time, and legal scholars, and remains really cited very widely in legal literature on resale royalties particularly, and also reanimated by a lot of artists, including Kevin McCoy in the term for Monograph. So it's a perfect example.
Yeah, we were so lucky to talk with him about that. And Lauren, I say it without exaggeration that I really think of you as the expert in the artist contract, someone who spent time with Seth Siegelob and whom I've bumped into in archives where these papers are held. So I know you've spent a lot of time researching the origins of the contract and the way in which artists at the time and the Art Workers Coalition in the late 60s, early 70s, as Nora is saying, how they imagined things that were actually more radical than what went into the contract, and maybe point towards some of the directions we're seeing now. And I wonder if you could just share that with us a little bit.
Sure. So this is really, my favorite thing to talk about with it at this point. When the artist contract was drafted, other artists also had this idea, of finding new structures for selling art, including other contracts. And as I've gone back over the various archival records, especially over the last year and a half, I'd say I've become more attuned to this. I've been really struck by how many of these kind of other proposals resisted models that only benefited individual artists, or which benefited individuals generally, and instead proposed alternate structures that were designed for collective benefit, where the wealth that is produced through the art market would actually be pooled and redistributed to a broader share of artists, especially those whose work was not valued by the market. For example, the plan for an artist survival fund would have redistributed money from the sale of works by deceased artists to living artists. And those funds could be used to, the idea was to use that money to support studio space for artists, to support, buying materials, even to establish a healthcare fund, among meeting all kinds of other needs. And so while a plan like the Artist Survival Fund and others never came to fruition. And Sigalam was probably very right in being skeptical about how feasible something like that would be. And in any case, I'm very interested in how such aims might be reclaimed today, especially as inequality only grows. This just becomes more and more important to talk about. And I think if smart contracts can address some of the technical hurdles in achieving something like that, it's worth exploring and thinking about.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think you speak to the way that artists are having to cover the cost of studios, and again, in this point A world, what's asked of artists, the kind of dignity of artistic labor, and sometimes the difficulty of sustainable economic models to support that, and this kind of idea of collective benefit, where there's a governance piece of how the funds get distributed. And so it's amazing to hear you say that, and I think to kind of amplify and draw out some sort of like prism angles on that, we wanted to bring in Kalani Nicole, who started to explore and experiment in this. And Lauren, I know you've done some experimentation too for, with distributing proceeds contractually to charities. But maybe what we'll do is go ahead and bring in Kalani to ask her a little bit about some of how she's done this with Transfer Gallery. Hi, Kalani. Thanks so much for joining us. And I know you told us in the prep that you and Lauren are collaborating at the moment. So feel free to share. I'm going to jump right in. And the question we want to ask you echoes what Lauren was saying about these kind of origins and collective visions that did not necessarily make it into the artist contract. So in your work at Transfer Gallery and the Pieces of Me show, could you tell us a little bit more about how you've implemented this kind of thinking across a group of artists? Oh, I think you're muted, Kalani.
Thanks. Yeah, just to qualify a little, an experiment is everything.
Do you want to, Kalani? I think your sound is anyone else having the same?
Yeah, it's a little.
Do you want to mute and rejoin for a second and just see if it? Yeah.
Maybe we'll take out the earbuds.
Yeah, I would go earphone-less. Yeah.
Sound better now?
I think maybe it has a Darth Vader undertone.
Oh no.
So I think now people know the truth that if you work in the blockchain space, you have to be willing to go over to the sci-fi side.
Yes, totally.
Kalani is like so good at technology, so this is really like a Murphy's Law moment.
Hello.
There's still a very strange undertone, Kalani. I'm so sorry. It could be.
Okay.
If you want to just kind of take the.
Okay.
Well, I'll just.
Can I ask a question, just following up on what you shared about kind of the vision for the. I'm sorry, it was not the artist contract. It was the artist.
The Art Workers Coalition.
Yeah, and the specific plan that was members of the Art Workers Coalition started the Artist Survival Fund.
Oh yes, okay.
The Artist Survival Plan, because honestly, as institutions are now really rethinking and reimagining how we can support artists, and especially a non-collecting institution like MCA Denver, where we don't collect an artist's work, we're thinking about services that we can provide to artists, many of which were that you shared and suggested. So I'm just taken by the vision of those who were a part of this 50 years ago. I mean, it's depressing that we're still in the same place, and a lot of the things, not a lot has changed, and that we're trying to think of solutions, but perhaps the only kind of silver lining for the current moment is that more institutions are thinking about how to support artists in this way, rather than just artists having to kind of demand it themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think we all need to be working together in new ways. Is what this points to. I think it's a huge mistake when sort of histories of artist organizing, or even when we talk about histories of activism, or when the word activism comes up, that we always get this image of just combat and of, you know, sides not even speaking to each other,
Right.
when really, you know, I mean, we do operate in a field that is very much hinges on relationships, and also, you know, does in some ways have like a bounty of resources, and in some ways has none. And I think we just need to find new ways of connecting the dots in a way. And I don't have the answers for it, but I'm really inspired by just how much this sort of need to find new structures is coming again. And, you know, maybe there are new potentials here just by virtue of the sheer technology that just were not possible before. I mean, one of the things, like, you know, one of the reasons why Seeker Lab landed on a contract that was quite limited, really, to primarily these sort of economic concerns within the individual work itself, was for pragmatism. You know, I mean, he thought, okay, this is something that could maybe work within the art world as it exists now. You know, it doesn't rely on forming new organizations. It certainly doesn't rely on legislation, though, you know, we can also talk about that. That was that position at the time. But it's to say that, you know, it was about getting something done fast that, you know, he thought maybe had a chance of being taken up.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that there weren't like much bigger goals out there.
Right.
And actually, that contract was really heavily criticized by a lot of artists at the time for ignoring these kind of broader redistributive aims.
Well, I feel like you see that now, where there's criticism from the market side for engaging economically, and also criticism for not being more progressive. And I want to just say one thing to Vali. I think we're bringing Kalani back on. I feel very optimistic for the tech. I read the chat. People are like, slow robot. But Lauren, you know, you're making me think of and just to say, your work is so rich in this area, and that I mentioned in the slide but didn't say out loud, you've written the definitive Oxford Handbook guide to the artist contract, and I'll be sure it's linked to the YouTube later. But just to say, you really call to mind the work that we got to talk to Judy and Bea about last week, where they took the Creeps and Weirdos sale from Dada and took the proceeds and put them in a fund intended to provide universal basic income for artists. So very much an embodiment of your thinking. And I think you really raised these themes of people who are working pragmatically in the world as it is, and people who are working speculatively in this kind of art project sense. So I know there's so much more we could ask you about, but I would love to bring Kalani back in to talk with us a little bit.
Better.
Oh no. Kalani, I hate to do this. I hate to speak for you, but I'm going to describe your work a little bit and let you echo us in the chat, in the comments. And if we can figure it out, we'll absolutely bring you back in. But what Kalani has done, among many other projects, is she had a show called Pieces of Me at Transfer Gallery, and for that show, if an artist sold a work, they got 70% of the proceeds, and then 30% was shared across the artist in the sale. Now, I know that Kalani is actively engaged in operationalizing that, and also in convening conversations across the field. So Kalani co-runs with her collaborator a working group on value, where they're extending that thinking to the formation of DAOs, or decentralized autonomous organizations for artists, which is to say these ways in which what Lauren said about smart contracts, these individual smart contracts. So when the title to a work transfers, a percentage goes back to the artist, a way of putting a lot of smart contracts together in a governance structure so that a percentage goes back to the artist and a percentage goes to a pool, and there's a model for how the surplus from the pool is distributed. Kalani, I just want to say you're amazing, and I'm so sorry that the whoever has
technology gods were not with us.
I know, it's like whatever sort of conspiracy.
Yeah, please check out Transfer Gallery and the exhibition.
Yeah,
it's brilliant. Really brilliant.
Yeah, and her work with the current museum as well, where the museum is a buying collective for digital work, where there's a copy of the work the museum owns and an exhibition copy everyone in the buying collective gets to keep. So really, like, please follow her work, and we'll be sure to link to those projects as well. But Lauren, maybe you know her work and you're collaborating. Is there anything that you want to help me kind of reflect in that?
Oh, well, I guess Kalani said a really funny thing. I don't know if it's okay to quote this, but we said as we were getting ready for this event that she and I actually met on Monday just to check in about our work, and she made a really great observation about being a kind of like age of contracts in a way, where just a lot of what we. A lot of artists and people in the field are just really rethinking what, again, these relationships look like, and what agreements can look like, and what they can do, and what they can produce, for others too, and just being very creative about how we, again, share and produce value, and be able to control a little bit where that goes and who that supports and how it is circulated, but also just to think about like what it means to create and just a community that we really feel good participating in, and an arts community that is really about like mutuality and mutual respect, mutual care. Again, pushing it away from this kind of like speculation culture, and that's a very double-sided term, so I don't mean to just poo-poo that. It's more complicated than that. But I think Kalani's work is a really wonderful standout right now in a moment when there is so much hype around NFTs in a way that to my mind tends to look a little bit more at like the dollar signs than the implications and possibilities of these tools. And I am just really, really excited and so happy that her exhibition exists and her work exists, which I think is a beautiful sort of model and bringing together of artists who are thinking about these new tools in the most expansive way possible.
I love that and wholeheartedly agree with it. And we apparently have made Kalani blush and have sent you a little bit. The chat's working.
It's all true.
No, it's all very true. And I think that's a beautiful juncture at which to transition. I'll say one more bit, transition over to art. This idea of the age of the contract, and the contract as emblematic, or the thing we can focus on to understand these changing power dynamics in the arts. And I think it's a great juncture to bring Art in so we can hear a little bit about his work kind of at the intersection of this work on assets and contracts and also communities and redistribution. So without further ado, Art Grayson will join us.
How's it going, y'all?
Hey, Art.
I'm so glad your tech is working.
I know.
Coming in clear. It's
nice. Crystal clear. We want to ask you about your work with Ujamaa, but just your background is really singular, I think, in coming to the subject. And I don't use the word polymathic very often, but really polymathic. You served in the Navy, you've done serious neuroscience research, you discovered blockchain very early, you're in communities where you're constantly showing people how to use it, how to mint NFTs, and you're starting a venture. So maybe just tell us a little bit kind of about your background and how you got into blockchain.
That's a good wrap up. I mean, you did pretty well yourself.
After I've spoken for Kalani, I gotta say.
Yeah, no, well, thanks. It really was like a good synopsis. So my background just coming in from the engineering field and the sciences, I really just was one of those really lucky, curious people who've been able to just dive into whatever has been of interest to me and explore it to the fullest. So yeah, whether that was operating nuclear reactors in the Navy, or supervising reactors for research at MIT, doing neuropsychology research through Harvard University, and working with different patient populations and also bench science research. It's really run the gamut. And then there's all these things in between that, you might not even expect, like, mechanics or, high-speed longboarding and stuff like that. So, My background is incredibly varied, but I just there is no shortage of things to be interested in. But all of them, the common theme for me is finding a sense of community, finding a problem, especially really sticky problems, um, and working on something that is not often picked up by a lot of folks. But I like kind of the way I operationalize it for myself. The way I think about it is like when you find yourself working on a problem that few other people want or can solve, you make yourself indispensable. So this is what I've always tried to go after. And in all cases, it's finding a sense of community. And there's the scientific community, there's the engineering community, there is the um, computer science community in terms of blockchain technology. I kind of fell into like the Bitcoin conversation and blockchain around 2013, and yeah, it was sort of in passing. So I was just kind of curious. It was more of like an academic exercise in terms of like, oh, what could this technology be used for? Basically like internet money or something like that. But I think at the time, obviously fast forwarding and seeing it's what it is, the behemoth it's turned into today. It tracks when you think about what the underlying philosophical principle of the actual currency is, what the distributed ledger technology can do, how cryptology has evolved from the 1970s to now. We're kind of on track in terms of what we're doing in algorithms in advanced computations, and this is kind of the future we've been waiting for.
First of all, I feel like a total slacker hearing about all the different things that you've done and accomplished. So I'm just gonna.
I feel less nonlinear.
I love that. I love that. I like people who are just like, you know what, the traditional nonlinear thing, don't even worry about it.
Well, that's amazing. That's what artists often do as well. But I did want to ask specifically about Ujamaa and kind of what you really are building. And you talked a lot about in all these different previous initiatives and efforts, it's been about building a community. And so to what extent is that kind of the main focus of this project, or is that kind of ancillary, or just how you're thinking about it?
No, great question, Nora. Thanks. So it's very much about building that sense of community. One of the other sort of like disparate things in my background is that I'm a muralist. I'm a muralist as well, primarily in the DC area. And this is just, again, how I was just like, you know what, I've got this idea. I think it'd be really great to illustrate it in a way to kind of get the point across rather than write a book about it or something like that again, right? So I was like, all right, this time I'll paint the idea instead of writing it out in words. And maybe someone will give me wall space. And that's how I became a muralist, and just kept doing it. People just kept asking me to paint more things, and I had more things to say. I won't shut up if you give me time. But it's because there are so many important things that you can actually get done. There's a lot that needs to be said. And there's honestly no shortage of people that look like me in public enough spaces, being able to verbalize, contextualize a lot of the issues in daily life that we've been dealing with, and the world that we live in. It's a perspective that needs to be heard. And I'm very fortunate to have great mentors, great family, great friends who pushed me into that spot, that have encouraged me in a very real way to take that space, to breathe what needs, that life into what needs to be said and heard. And I'm a happy conduit, really, as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, that background in terms of my arts is how Ujamaa really came to be. And it really falls along with what you were saying earlier, Amy, in terms of the decolonizing process. So, I mean, I think that's like a really, I don't know, maybe a lot of people slept on that term, but like the idea that NFTs as a decolonizing process is like a really, really interesting thing that could be an entire talk in and of itself. But Ujamaa as a company, it's like a disintermediation tool. You've got a lot of artists who are, considered like the emerging artists, right? They've got a body of work. They've got some dedicated fans and followers, but they don't really have, and like they haven't reached that established sort of professional tier in the traditional art investment world. So JAMA is meant to create more of like a standardized path toward becoming that professional, established artist. Being able to put all this tacit knowledge that is fairly germane to people who have that like background and pedigree in terms of going through the MFA programs, and even for a lot of folks that do go through those programs, they still find themselves struggling to figure out what's the next step. How do I get there? What's cataloging going to do for me? Like, do they even know, first and foremost, that they should be cataloging their work, doing artist statements and essays that describe their pieces, finding people to shepherd their work, talking to people who can mentor them. It's not all about getting a dealer or getting someone to represent your work, because there's always going to be people, here and there that either are gatekeepers or, you pay them a fee and they'll go find somebody for you, get your work put up somewhere. Why would an artist think, oh, maybe I should donate a painting to a museum? That'd be a great way to make money, right? No one thinks about that. But once you do that, that goes on your portfolio. Next thing you know, you're a listed artist in a museum, right? You can write off the work against your profits in terms of, talk to a tax advisor, but
cost of materials.
And it helps to grow not only the exposure of your work, but it also helps to grow your, it helps to grow you as a professional.
Sure.
Right. So these are the kinds of things that like a lot of folks that we're just missing. I mean, it starts as a product. Yes. Like we're building a product for folks to be able to sell their work. NFTs is an exceptional tool. It is not just a JPEG for a bunch of money. The NFT is, I mean, think of something you'd want to do, like a task, like an action, right? Like NFTs could probably do it. They're incredible programs that like effectively, if I handed someone an iPhone and was like, hey, guess what? This thing costs like $50,000 or $500,000. And you were like, great, I'm going to resell it for like twice that. And you don't even turn it on. That's how people are treating NFTs right now. They're incredible programs, right? Resale rights. We don't have that kind of an established thing, as Amy perfectly put out there. That's a little tidbit of like history that a lot of folks don't even know about. So that we're missing that kind of thing, and being able to actually programmatically create that using smart contracts. Beautiful, beautiful idea.
I mean, I don't want to jump in if you're still, but I think that you're talking about how to operationalize a pathway to very large changes in the way that we imagine the future, and the forms, the way that Lauren mentioned the Artist Support Fund covering studio expense, the way that these kind of supports for individuals and in community kind of helps the sort of solidarity economy piece of that helps reshape power structures in the arts and who can support in the arts. And art, I just have to tell you, decolonial practice is how I actually met our next speaker, Dr. Finley. And so I think you've kind of teed that up perfectly. So we're really excited to watch what happens next with Ujamaa, and Lauren with your work, and Nora, maybe you have other questions before we.
I think just with an eye to time, we should probably bring Dr. Finley on before it gets too late. But I do want to echo Amy and just saying thank you for sharing your wisdom and your experience and your expertise, because it's so illuminating, and to see how these tools are being interrogated so differently is really eye-opening. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Hi, Dr. Finley. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
So good to be here. First of all, your technology is working.
I know, full of gratitude that you sound like you normally do.
Well, we are so honored to share the screen with you tonight. And I just want to make sure that our audience knows just what makes, I would say, your perspective so singular is not only are you an art historian who's engaged deeply in art historical scholarship, but that you also teach and do research on art markets. And that was part of how why we wanted to invite you to be a part of the conversation tonight. So if you could maybe just kick things off with us by sharing how that came about for you, your interest in the art market, and why you've found it so, I would say, probably rich and layered to continue as you continue to probe and engage with it.
Thanks so much, Nora, and thank you, Amy. It's an honor to be here with the both of you and with everyone here on the panel tonight. I also just have to give a shout out to Lauren Van Haften-Schick, who I love to death and from whom I learn so much all the time. So Lauren, you're amazing. So anyway, and I'm going to segue into answering your question, which is to say that, when I finished college, my first job was as curator of the Berenice Abbott Archive. It was purchased by a man named Ron Kurtz, who was an art collector while Abbott was still alive. And one of the things that we did every year with the collection was to make donations to colleges and universities. Mr. Kurtz purchased the archive as a collector because he was interested in supporting Abbott's legacy, really, and building her legacy through a company called Commerce Graphics that still exists and sells her work. But he also was very much a philanthropist and gave of the collection. And every year when we did that, we had to have appraisals of the collection. So that was kind of my first entry into the art market and really understanding art appraisal through Penelope Dixon, one of the leading photography appraisers in the world. We always had to go to auction. So we wanted to monitor and keep a close eye on Ron's investment in Abbott's archive. It's also through that experience that I met Lauren Van Haften-Schick's mother, Julia Van Haften, who did the career retrospective of Abbott in 1990. So,
oh my gosh, I didn't realize all the interrelationships. It's amazing.
Yeah. And so I'll just say, kind of to wrap that piece up, for me in my career, I started on the commercial side. I did not, I was a Spanish major in college. I worked in the art department at Wellesley as my work study job. But it was through my different positions in the commercial side that I ultimately landed to do a PhD in art history and African American studies. And I actually thought when I went to grad school that I was going to do a dissertation on the art market. Because I was really interested in, and the reason I was catapulted back into the academy is because increasingly, and this is, the 80s and 90s when I'm doing this work, I was the only person who looked like me, the only Black woman who was, in the auction room, who often went in and out of the galleries that we frequented or who appraised the collections that were brought to us. And so I really wanted to see, Black artists represented in sales and in exhibitions. I wanted to see Black collectors in the room. I wanted to be able to be in a position to educate the next generation of students who would, do the work of either the art historian or the curator, but who also might go on to become, a doctor, an engineer, a lawyer, someone in finance who would then, go on to actually make the kinds of investments that are needed to diversify this ecosystem. And this is, again, work that compelled me, more than 20 years ago. It was really, really important to me. And I feel like I'm doing that now at the AUC Art Collective. And I think, finally, I'll say just about, the art market in the academy or in art history. I actually think this is a topic that should be taught. It should be taught from the perspective of art historians. It should be taught to people who are curators, because you're going to have to deal with it, as you know, Nora, in the museum all the time. When you deal with boards of directors or when you want to bring a new work into a collection, et cetera. But also I think from the perspective of artists, because artists want to not only be successful artists, but they also want to, make a living from it. So they need to know about the market as well. And so the first time I taught my course on the art market was over a decade ago, after a number of scholarly works had come out on the art market. Thompson's $12 million stuffed shark, Thornton's 7 Days in the Art World. Some of them are, more fun to read. Or Velthius's The Architecture of the Contemporary Art Market. But when those books came out, I kind of came back to myself and said, I think we might need something that deals with the art market here. And I taught a course, I'm a tenured faculty member at Cornell on the art market. And this was at a time, again, like talking about technology and, what we have now versus what we had then. when our registration system had a glitch in it, and it was meant to be a seminar of 15 people, and it ended up being 25 people. And I couldn't say no, I couldn't turn them away. And it was clear to me that I had students from the business school, students from, from the art school, and also students from art history. So I think it's important.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I think I remember when I was an undergraduate and I was an art history major, those who were studio artists had to take art history classes as part of their requirement, but those who were art history focused did not have to take studio classes. And I always found that really unfair. And I will say that the most desired class that could have been offered was a practicum on how do you do this? How do you navigate it? How do you ask the questions that you're afraid to ask? And how do you do it from a place of confidence? Because whatever you're thinking, dozens of other artists are also thinking. So I think you're clearly filling a much needed void academically and just for pragmatically as well.
Yeah, and I think it's really field building, the work that you're doing. And I think you've kind of highlighted how unusual it is to talk about markets and art at the same time. I wanted to put a link in the chat to the Instagram for the AUC Art Collective. I think your programming is so great. So we'll do that.
We just came back from LA.
Amazing. So I think the reason we really wanted to ask you about your background on the commercial side as well as the art historical side is that it's emblematic of some of the larger work that I think you're doing in the blockchain space and some of the larger conversations you're holding space for in the blockchain arena. And we wanted to ask you your introduction to blockchain. And when you and I were talking before, it's like through a common project that we have, which is connected to the theme of decolonial practice that Art was mentioning. And I just wondered if you could share a little bit about that.
Thank you, Amy. So so my brain is a fog because of COVID, right? And but I want to say it was like the fall of 19 or the spring of 20, but definitely in person before lockdown. President Campbell, Dr. Mary Schmidt Campbell, who's a leader and force herself, not as a college president, of course. I mean, not only as a college president, of course, but also, in the art world, being one of the early directors of the Studio Museum in Harlem and filling other important positions in New York City Cultural Affairs. Anyway, she called me to join her for lunch one day. She said she had a friend visiting, Susan DeManil, and Susan came in town from New York just for the day for lunch. We had a lovely lunch, but she actually gave us an assignment. We had to read a paper, and Amy, you're a co-author on this paper on art and antiquities and blockchain, really looking at solutions for cultural heritage. And so we discussed this paper over lunch, and Susan and I talked afterwards, and we've been, very, very tight since then. Art and Antiquities Blockchain Consortium is an organization that she's a part of, you're a part of, and many other bright minds like Anne Bracegirdle as well. And working with Art and Antiquities Blockchain Consortium, we organized in January of 2021 a blockchain salon, Finding Common Ground, Blockchain and Cultural Heritage. And that was a salon over 4 weeks where we exposed the Atlanta University Center community and my students and classes to blockchain and cultural heritage to kind of look at the relationship between understanding the possibility in the future of blockchain for how we might do things like collections management in our museums, or to share, for example, collections of cultural heritage with home or host countries, or even to think about the redistribution of wealth, or the way in which we might want to work with museums in designing ways to think about a different structure that might involve re-examining boards, re-examining how works of art come into collections and so on. And it was a really fruitful 4 weeks. And then afterwards, Together with Art and Antiquities Blockchain Consortium, we continue to work with students in my course called the Curatorial Practicum. And that's the capstone course for curatorial studies, where students organize an exhibition. And we specifically worked with a collection from the Spelman College Museum of Fine Art. That's a collection of a Spelman alumna named Mabel Murphy Smythe-Haith, who traveled as a diplomat in West Africa and amassed a collection of African art objects and donated them to Spelman. And on the 25th anniversary of the museum this year, we thought that it was appropriate to look at this foundational collection of the museum with these questions around blockchain and cultural heritage. And students really took it up. They had incredible and exciting exhibition ideas that included these works of art, but also thought about the technology through smart contracts. Many of them worked very closely with you in class, with Lauren as well, to think about ways that, for example, we can use the technology for even reparations, or even to thinking through decolonial practices. Imagine how even in collecting, artists can continue to receive revenue streams for their work. So it's been a really fruitful collaboration, and I think that there are so many other ways that we can continue to do this work in the future.
I want to just pick up on that. I mean, you just shared so many amazing kind of initiatives and projects. But if we're thinking even, and I know you have been a part of so many others in the recent years, but if we're thinking about kind of blockchain and this technology kind of as advancing equity and inclusion in the arts, what do you think some of the kind of most important or pressing questions that we should be thinking about regarding that? Sorry for that disruption. Like, what are the possibilities that you see opening up through blockchain or NFTs that we haven't kind of maybe surfaced yet?
I think, I mean, in listening to the entire program so far, I think that you've actually covered a lot of it.
Yeah, my mom.
So I think you've covered so much. For me, it's kind of like looking at how we might restructure arts ecosystems. Mm-hmm. Whether they're museums or whether it's even looking at, say, like the entertainment industry. I know there are a lot of people in this space that are, doing things that kind of cut out the middle person, in order to connect the artist directly with the product, right? With what's being collected or what's being streamed. I also think that, things like sustainability are the kinds of things that we have to talk about. So if we're talking about, DEI&A, one of my dear sister colleagues and friends, Bridget Cooks. Sorry, I'm not used to this.
Neither are we.
So Dr. Bridget Cooks, she's a scholar at UCI. We were on a panel last, Thursday. Well, actually, she did the keynote on Thursday. It's a panel for a symposium that was hosted at Bard. And she kind of went through in her keynote, a number of different foundational exhibitions of African American art. Her book is Exhibiting Blackness, and it's like the book to get about the histories of African American art exhibitions in the U.S. But anyway, she actually kind of renamed the acronym. Instead of we call it IDEA, DEI&A, we kind of use the letters, but she said DIE. And I think that that's something to kind of think about in terms of what is this DEI&A initiative really about? If it's not going to be sustainable, if it's going to be something that I lived through in the 1980s, I lived through in the end of the 1990s and so on. So I think one of the biggest words that I would put out there is really trying to use and harness this technology to redistribute power, to redistribute the way in which these interlocking systems function, whether it's museums, collectors, free ports, we can go auction houses, et cetera. I also think that, one of the really beautiful things, and I've heard these sentiments already echoed earlier on, are, just the way in which, this technology builds community, and that's something that's central, is beautiful. It can be everlasting, that we can have, common interests and come to common ground, right? I also think that, looking at issues of belonging are important. And this was also mentioned earlier, and I think I shared with you, Amy, my daughter's doing a project on the wealth gap, but to think about that, let's close the wealth gap. That's something that can be done. And then finally, if we look at, centuries of oppression, especially for, people from underrepresented groups in this country, especially African Americans, that's the perspective that I'm coming from, we can also talk about how, this technology can be harnessed too for different forms of reparation. And I think many people are already beginning to do that with the proceeds from different forms of blockchain interactions. I hope that's not too much.
No, that's incredible.
It's amazing.
You're just, and you're giving us all so much to think about and to hold space for, and to watch for the continuation of. And I couldn't agree with you more that these forms of value and redistribution and reparations are the extensions of these conversations around artists and by extension communities of people banding together to create things of value and to redistribute surplus or other forms of wealth across groups. So I'm glad that we were able to put the AUC Art Collective Instagram link in the chat. So I learned so much from your Instagram, honestly.
That is Ms. Rachel Brown, a Spelman alumna of the class of 2010, who's our fearless program manager. And thank you. And I think our students are doing really great work, especially in this area. And I know you've met one of them recently.
A couple of them, and I don't want to speak on behalf of their projects, which are still work in progress, but really exceptional work. And I'll see if we can put Dr. Cook's book in the link as well. But Cheryl, Dr. Finley, we really thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you. All right, we'll talk to you really soon. Great, thanks again. Nora, I feel like we're back in the cockpit here. We've talked a little about landing the plane from having had the opportunity to talk with people, and maybe what we can do is share some of the takeaways and then reflect a little bit on the arc of the program overall, and have a little time still for questions. So we hope that in session 4, episode 4, we've gotten to really talk about the significance of the prior 3 episodes of material and the ways that power dynamics are starting to change within and from outside of the arts as we navigate NFTs, and not just the meteoric sales, which may be bringing new collectors into the arts and changing some of that taste-making apparatus, but really the structural work that's happening in communities of artists and curators and others, and kind of asking like what are the politics of engagement with all of these sort of shifting events.
Well, I think, Amy, just to put just add a little bit more to that, I think what's so either disheartening or maybe hopeful, depending on how you look at that glass, if it's half full or half empty, that the issues that artists have been trying to solve and others have been trying to solve for decades, that here we are kind of on the precipice of something new that might actually get at solving some of that, that all of the kind of advances and retreats and advances that have happened, that we can put under a kind of quote of progress. But really, if we're thinking about trying to solve for problems, solve for inequities, solve for these intractable issues that we face, they have been there for so long. And it might take that disruptive force from another field to kind of dislodge that intractable thing and help us find a way forward. We don't know, but there's some hopefulness, certainly, that it might set us on a path toward that.
Definitely. That there are these ways that technology can help us to automate processes that have been so logistically hard, like granting resale royalties, and to lower the transaction costs of organizing for people to operate together. But I can appreciate how long people have been trying to solve questions, and especially when these questions extend from sustainability of artistic practice to endemic structural racism, this idea that questions have been around and not addressed for a long time, it can be hard to imagine the ways that change happens. But I think maybe what we can offer by way of conclusion is to kind of think for a moment about the structure of the program overall, and kind of looking back at the kind of four parts of what we've been doing. You know, we really started in episode 1 looking at the origin stories, and if you want to, like the origin stories of blockchain, and how this is both a money story and a knowledge story, the cryptocurrency and also anarchist outside of government story. And then the knowledge story of Haber and Sternetta, and how we'll know what was true about the past without trusting a central administrator. And then really trying to get specific about artists and makers, and then also trying to understand the complexity and these kaleidoscopic lenses of collecting and how that operates. And I think what we really land on, and what really motivated us to engage in this process, is being able to talk today and to articulate questions together that have to do with these plate tectonic shifts, seismic shifts in power and inclusion, and equity in the sense of ownership, and also a sense of fairness or redistribution. And this is what really lands us on artist stories and democracy stories. And I think that is inclusive in the sense that everyone is an artist and also everyone is a citizen.
Absolutely. And I would say that all of the stories that you mentioned, and what we've kind of tried to pull out with each of the different episodes, is that these are all human stories. These are all individuals who were trying to solve for a problem. It even gets at that idea of trust, either the lack of trust or the need to build community to establish trust, that kind of courses through all the different stories that we have highlighted, and that is, in a sense, both the kind of possibility that is the future, but it's also what has shaped kind of the past. You know, that's what has got us to this point where we can try to imagine all these different possible utilizations and ways to implement this technology that might solve for problems that we don't even know will exist.
Right. No, completely. And so, Nora, in our planning, you've kind of teed up this vision of an ice cream sundae of questions, right?
I know. I have this image in my head for everyone who's still with us of an ice cream cone that has like 40 different scoops on top of it. And each scoop is kind of a question that we want to pose that we don't have the answers to. And I think what we really want to do is leave you all with a rigorous set of questions that reflects, again, just the paths that lie in front of us. They may be detrimental. They may be kind of harrowing. They may be full of possibility, but there are so many. And I think why so many of us love to work with artists and be surrounded by artists is because artists often can engage with those kinds of questions from very different perspectives and points of view, harnessing an approach that is unusual and distinctive. And that's what we want to throw out there. And that's what we kind of want to leave you all with, are a number of questions that we couldn't possibly answer now. But when you watch this, which I'm sure you will in 5 years, that, maybe there will be a solution or an answer or a response even to what we're posing.
I've been teasing Nora that the ice cream sundae picture is the kind of thing that if you can eat it all, you eat for free. And I think that tells you that I have not been spending time watching French existentialist cinema. So this is just a taster of some of the questions that arose for us. And again, I think what's most important here is asking the questions or trying to ask the right questions, whether they're possible to answer or not. So how will NFTs collapse taste-making structures if 91% of the people who bid on Beeple's Everydays were new to the auction house? Does that change the art world ecosystem? How will artists gain power or economic sustainability? We've talked about this a lot today in terms of resale royalties, fractional equity, and artists operating cooperatively, and skill building, platforming, what Art mentioned about creating communities of knowledge as well. And then what will happen with museums? Will they democratize? Will governance become more participatory, or will it narrow? I think that's really the biggest question. What are the most radical, optimistic, or dystopian futures? Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things I've always felt, the two things that I've always felt in relation to these topics are that it's easy to conflate economics and politics when we look at participation, and it's important always to understand what is an economic form of participation, like owning shares in an NFT, and what is a political form of participation, like being invited to pull a chair up to the table, having a kind of say in a governance system. And I think for me, what's really important about political participation in these conversations is that hospitality is an underappreciated civic virtue, that to participate, Dr. Finley spoke to this too, but you have to feel invited. So it is my hope that everyone feels invited, not put off by the fanfare and vagueness of some conversations around blockchain, but invited to the specificity of the conversation and the questions that affect all of us, and that maybe we have an ability to have an effect on the future of. So Nora, I want to turn it back over to you, and maybe we have time to open it up if there are questions in the chat.
Well, I think speaking of hospitality, it would be very inhospitable of us if we didn't open it up to questions from our audience. If you have any, if you're still with us, I know we've gone way over our time, but there was so much to include. So please submit your question in the chat if you haven't already. I think there may have been one early on, and perhaps our exceptional MCA Denver digital producer, Cheyenne, can pull that up. Here we go. From Sarah Johnson. Amy, I'll read it. I'm pretty sure it's going to be for you, not for me. Art dealers entering the space as agents for emerging artists. Kakao allow galleries in Korea to drop weekly curated NFTs from artists they represent. Is this available in the US as well?
Well, first of all, thank you for introducing me to this initiative. I'm not familiar with it, and I think it's a great idea. I think that there's some NFT platforms like Super Rare that have been doing programming where they highlight certain artists on the platform. But this idea of bundling is really powerful. I actually sat in on Professor David Yermak from the first episode's class earlier today, and a speaker from Dapper Labs, the company that started the CryptoKitties, or spun out from the company that started the CryptoKitties, and was talking about bundles of NBA Top Shot images or video works. And I think this is an important additional aspect of this question of artists banding together. So not just I'm going to get resale royalties or equity, or I'm going to succeed in the NFT space, but I'm going to create critical mass so that a rising tide lifts all boats. And there's a network externality, to speak in economic terms. I always think of this in the traditional art world, where Damien Hirst, part of how he became famous as an artist is that he organized a group show of all of his classmates at Goldsmiths. Great. So he convinced Nicholas Rota and Charles Saatchi to come to the show. And there's a really big difference between saying, would you please come to a show of just my work in an abandoned warehouse in Far East London, versus would you come to a group show of all my classmates? And I think what you're speaking to is the way that we can imagine those sorts of systems where it's not Nora sharing her NFTs, but Nora saying, who are 5 other people I think are stunning and amazing, and putting together a package of NFTs. So this critical mass question, this bundling, where when you bundle something, not everybody has to agree on what their favorite is. You can have a bundle of 5 things and heterogeneous demand where I like one and Nora likes the other. So I think that's a really great example of platforming and a really lovely amplification of some of the themes. So thank you, Sarah, for that question.
And so I think, Amy, we may be out of Q&A for the moment, but I just want to say that to anyone who is watching, maybe not live, but does have other questions about this, please reach out to the museum via social media or website. We would love to be able to continue the conversation around NFTs, blockchain, and future states with all of you going forward. So I want to just take a moment to thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I want to thank our incredible participants who shared their backgrounds and their work with us in such beautiful and eloquent ways. I want to thank the incredible production team at MCA Denver, Cheyenne, Courtney, Kelly, and so many others who made this all possible. And none of it would be possible without the incredible Amy Whitaker for partnering with us on this project and for continuing on this journey to kind of break down and share out as widely as possible the impact of this incredible phenomenon. Like it, hate it, whatever you think about it, it's here. And how do we reckon with it? And how do we engage with it productively and sensitively? So Amy, it has been an honor to share the screen with you these last 4 weeks. I'm going to miss you next week. So thank you. I want to thank Sotheby's for sponsoring this. And Amy, I hand it to you.
Just to reflect that back, it's been completely an honor and a privilege to be in conversation with you. Nora, you've held such space and such curatorial eye for what are the most important questions and things to focus on as we try to make sense of this kind of fire hose of information and change with a lot of distracting, glittery objects, and then a lot of fascinating but really nascent structural work. Thank you to your amazing team at MCA Denver, and also a heartfelt thanks to all of the participants who have been uncommonly generous with their time and expertise, and also to all of you who are joining. I bear witness to the high quality NFT Christmas list joke in the chat, and we've really enjoyed hearing from all of you every week. So we'll be in withdrawal next Wednesday, but hopefully we will all continue to get to discuss these ideas. Nora, thanks again, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Have a great one, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Yeah.